So today is our last week in the series called Relationship Status. Next week, we're going to have a special message for our moms and our ladies. So bring your moms, bring any special lady that's in your life, bring them to church next week. We're going to have a special message about a humble spirit that is open to God's call for each one of us. So don't miss that. But in the meantime, if you have missed any of our weeks leading up to today in the Relationship Status series, you can go back to our website and watch or listen there at yorkspringsumc.org. Real easy, yorkspringsumc.org. So you can get caught up. But I want to say first and foremost, I have said this several times already, and I'm going to say it again. Relationships are a part of what it means to be human. That's just naturally how it is. Relationships are part of what it means to be human. The question is not whether we have a relational status. The question is, what is our relational status? So 3 weeks ago now, we talked about the singleness status. We talked about whether you are single for a life or single for just a season. It is a gift that allows us to be able to focus on God without a divided heart. So we can give God everything. We can put our entire focus on Him. 2 weeks ago, then, we talked about our status when it changes and then we're in a relationship. In order to really love others well, we have to love God first. And just as importantly, we have to love ourselves. Once we love God and once we love ourselves, it's only then that we can actually care for the ones around us in the way that they are designed and needed to be cared for. And then last week, we talked about our relationship status as when it gets complicated. Because let's be real, relationships can be messy, they can be difficult, they can certainly be complicated. So when things do get difficult, what do? We are to look for the attitudes of Jesus. And when we look for those attitudes of Jesus, they can help us to start to heal that relationship. They can help us to start restore that relationship. And they can even help us, if the relationship is not right for us, they can even help us to determine to get out of that relationship. But today now, we're moving on to the last one. We're talking about being married, the relationship status of married. Now, I realize that there are some here today who are married, who this is just going to build on your marriage. This is going to give you even more strength in your marriage. For some of you, you've been married in the past, and maybe this message is going to help you determine if that's for you again in the future. And if you're not married, I still believe this message is for you because it helps to set that standard that God expects of marriage. So whether that's something in your future or not, it's giving us that idea to know what a marriage is to look like. Because in all reality, I'd bet to say every person in this room is going to have an opportunity someday, somewhere, somehow, to speak life into somebody you deeply care about. And that could be a child, that could be a grandchild, that could be a friend, but someday somebody else is going to be thinking about marriage, and you are going to have an opportunity to give them helpful guidance from God into that marriage or into that decision to be married. Besides, marriage is God's idea first, right? So guess what? If it's God's idea first, then God has an awful lot to say about it. So we're going to be talking about that here in a moment. But I have found that in marriage, you can expect two things. There are going to be joys. There are going to be things that you are going to celebrate, that you're going to be excited to celebrate. But there are also going to be difficulties. There are going to be trials that come up in that marriage, in that relationship. We just need to expect it. Now, I believe there is a place for both of those things. There's a place for the joys and celebrations, and there's a place for the trials and the difficulties. They're there, and they do help us in many ways. But when our relationship status is married, we enter into a sacred place, and we would be wise to look at it as that. This is a sacred place. So the biblical story of marriage begins in the very beginning of the Bible, the very first chapter of the Bible. In fact, in the first 5 verses of Genesis, the first book in the Bible, we hear the story of the Creator God creating all sorts of things, right? And what He does, He just voices it. His voice just speaks, and all these things come into place. They come into being made. He speaks, and day comes in, night comes in, land, sea, birds, the animals, the fish, the stars, the sun, the moon, the plants, the trees. He speaks and it all comes into being. But when it came to making human beings, He did it a little bit differently. God formed humankind, out of the dust of the earth with His own hands. His own hands, He formed it and then breathed life into it. Breathed life into them. The story speaks of this intimacy. When God does it differently, it's not just a voice making something. His own hands and His own breath make it. There's an intimacy in that creation of the first people. Then in chapter 5, we can read a little bit here where God sort of recaps again how he made human beings. And it says, "This is the written account of the descendants of Abraham. When God created human beings, he made them to be like himself. He created them male and female, and he blessed them, and he called them human." Now, something you might not realize is that God created everything in this order to complement one another. So think about day and night. They complement each other, right? Land and sea, the sky and the stars, the sun and the moon, even the birds and the animals or the fish and the reptiles, they all complement one another. So this is my first point today, because the same is true for the creation of male and female. God created man with a unique spirit, and he created woman with a unique spirit. Marriage is a time when two individuals commit to seek out these two realities. They learn to bend and they learn to lean on each other, but they also learn to see this beauty that God has created to fit together seamlessly. Now, I'm not saying marriage is perfect in the way that we think of perfect, but when the Creator has two things that come together the way that they are designed to come together, it's like absolutely nothing else. It is a beauty that is like nothing else. Author and lecturer Michael Ventura says this. He said, "Marriage is a journey towards an unknown destination." That's true, isn't it? Anybody who's ever been married or is married, you know this, right? Marriage is a journey towards an unknown destination. The discovery that people must share not only what they don't know about each other, but what they don't even know about themselves, right? So it's not just learning about each other, but we even learn about ourselves. It's a journey that I know many of you are on, or many will even be on in one day. So I'm not advocating, I'll just make this real clear, I'm not advocating for traditional roles of men and women in marriage, and I'm certainly not attacking it either. I'm simply making the point that God has from the very, very beginning intended for the complementary unification of the male and female creations to be in union, to be married as a man and woman, as husband and wife. The weakness of one is able to be strengthened, covered by strength of the other, and vice versa. There is an encouragement in this complementary order that God has created that is a lot like Christ, and it actually should prompt us to be even more like Christ. The relational status of marriage is one that Paul speaks of. He speaks a lot of it. He speaks of it with very clarity. He's very direct. He's very convicted by it. And he gives us instruction to the early church of how to navigate in such a special relationship. And further, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. For wives, this means submit to your husbands as to the Lord. For a husband is the head of his wife, and Christ is the head of the church. He is the Savior of his body, the church. As the church submits to Christ, so you wives should submit to your husbands in everything. For husbands, this means love your wives just as Christ loved the church. He gave up his life for her to make her holy and clean, washed by the cleansing of God's word. He did this to present her to himself as a glorious church without a spot or wrinkle or any other blemish. Instead, she will be holy and without fault. In the same way, husbands ought to love their wives as they love their own bodies. For a man who loves his wife actually shows love for himself. No one hates his own body, but feeds and cares for it, just as Christ cares for the church. And we are members of his body. Now that's a lot. I use this one in marriage counseling, and I have to go into deep depth sometimes and explain some of this because first, these verses are very familiar to us. We often even hear them in the marriage ceremony. So at weddings, you've probably heard some of these verses. You may have heard pieces of them. But often it is emphasized that the wife should submit to her husband because he is the head of the family. There's certainly a special place that the man holds in the marriage covenant, and he plays a very unique role. But to single out the woman as the one who is to submit, right, because that's kind of an ugly word to some today, but if a woman is only to submit, we're kind of missing the bigger point. And I say this because, let me back up here a second. Oh, I think I have it forward. Here we go. If we rush past verse 21, if we go ahead and just jump right into verse 22 where it says the wife is to submit to the husband, we miss the whole point, which is right in the first verse. And further, to submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Submit to one another, okay? So that means They're both submitting to one another, right? The point is mutual submission. A marriage that honors God is one that begins in verse 21. That verse 21, to submit to each other, is the foundation. Everything else hangs on that. There are two forms of submission, though, spoken here in these few verses. The wife is to submit to the husband as the church submits to Christ, all right? So how does the church submit to Christ? That's the question. Wives, if that's what we're supposed to do, we need to listen. How do we submit to Christ? The church serves Christ, right? The church loves Christ. The church lifts up Christ. What would happen if we wives took that seriously? This is not a punishment. This really is a privilege. It's a privilege to serve. It's a privilege to love. It's a privilege to lift up your husband in a Christian marriage. The second one is the submission of the husband. What does the submission of the husband look like? They are to love the wives like Christ loves the church. I don't know about you ladies, but I think that's probably a heavier one than we may have. They are to love wives like the church. So how did Christ love the church? Men, that's the question to be asking. If you were to love your wives as Christ loves the church, how did he love the church? Well, think about this. He gave up his life for the church, did he not? He gave up his life for the church. This is, again, not a punishment. This is a privilege for men to love their wives and to submit to them by giving up their own lives. Now, I'm not saying to be killed in that way, but to give your life to them. Men are to say no to things in order to love their wives. They are to protect their wives. They are to look for ways to sacrifice to lift them up. This is a mutual submission. We both give into this relationship. Both male and female give into this. Each person in the marriage is complementing the other by aggressively trying to serve and love the other. That's what it's about. And Paul goes on here a little bit further to express a plan God has for marriage. And he says, as the scriptures say, a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one. This is a great mystery, but it is an illustration of the way Christ and the church are one. So again, I say, each man must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. That word submit, as it often gets taken out of context, really means to respect. We're submitting to each other to respect each other, to love each other, to take care and serve each other. Paul quotes Genesis 2 when he states that a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one. Some versions even say they become one flesh, all right? So you get the closeness. This is closer than closeness, right? They become one. That tells us also the intimacy that God has designed in this relationship. The man and the woman will leave their father and their mother to become an entirely new family. The plan of marriage is for two people with totally different backgrounds, right? Different makeups, different DNA, to become one. One. This doesn't happen overnight, though. This is not something that's going to just happen on that day that you make your commitment, that you make your vows. This takes time. This takes effort, and it takes commitment, and it takes discovery. So becoming one is definitely a mystery. There's no doubt about that. It is. In some ways, no matter how long two individuals have dated or engaged, upon marriage, it's all of a sudden like you wake up next to a stranger. You know, when Matt and I got married, I have to say, there were many times where it was like, wow, I'm here. It's something totally different. And no matter how long you date or how long you're engaged, it definitely can feel like you are waking up to a stranger. There certainly are things that are known about one another and things that are appreciated about one another. But in the end, leaving your family origin into a new family is definitely a mystery. It's a mystery. I'll say it's a mysterious adventure that is a lifelong endeavor. Any kind of game that you ever played, like Clue. Anybody ever play Clue? Yeah? So any kind of mystery game that we've ever played, what do? We look, we seek, we ask good questions, right? We're critical thinkers in those moments. Paul says that the same kind of deep truths that are there to discover in the endless connections between Christ and his church are the same truths that exist in the connections that are made between a man and a woman, between a husband and a wife. So do you treat your marriage like it's exciting mystery? Right? That you're seeking to know this person even more? Do you long to know the depths of your spouse? What if you were to consider this commitment that you've made to another human being as the greatest adventure that you've ever taken. That is an exciting mystery, something fun to be on. I think we should ask more questions. I think in our marriages, we slack off, we get kind of used to the person being there all the time. I'm just as guilty of this. And we don't ask nearly as many questions. You know, one of the greatest keys to unlocking a vibrant marriage is the ability to communicate with one another with intention, all right? So not just your passerby kind of conversation like, oh, hi, honey, how are you? Good morning, right? No, intentionally getting deeper in our conversations. Consider formulating a few good questions. A few good questions that maybe you could use when you go out on a date night, or you can use over breakfast, or you can use when you're laying in bed together. Ask questions that cause reflection, or even more importance, that reveal what the other person feels. I know men, sometimes we don't like the idea of feelings and emotions, but they're important for both of us. So how about questions like this? What makes you most alive? Could you think about asking your spouse, what makes you most alive? What makes you most alive? What are your hopes and your dreams even? You know, a lot of times we think we know them, but our hopes and dreams can change over the years. So ask your spouse, what are your hopes and dreams? What are you even most afraid of? There's a good question. Or what are you most proud of? What can I do to help you feel valued? What can I do to help you? A couple's ability to communicate in a way in which a marriage is strengthened, it strengthens it for life. If we can learn how to communicate like that, to get deeper, it will strengthen it for the long haul. I have a story for you here. A married couple, they had this quarrel, and they ended up giving each other the silent treatment. This is not a story about my husband and I, so please don't think that. Not a story about us. But they had this quarrel, and they decided to give each other the silent treatment. It went on for a few days. And the man realized, though, after a few days, he needed his wife's help. He was about to go on a trip, and he needed to take a flight, and so for a business meeting, so this was very, very important. And he had to get up at 5 a.m., but he didn't want to break the silence. He didn't want to be the first one to make the move and break the silence. So he decided he would write her a note and said, please wake me up at 5 a.m. So he wakes up the next morning, but he realizes it's well past 5 a.m. It's now 9 a.m. He has missed his flight. He is not anywhere near his business meeting. He has missed it all. And he's so determined and angry. He wants to find out why his wife did not wake him up, why she did not help him when he asked her to. When he came to realize that there was a note beside him that said, it's 5 a.m., wake up. That's terrible communication, by the way. Please don't do that. Somebody just break the silence. Be the bigger guy. Don't even do that to begin with. Don't play the silence game. How's that? But this kind of communication is certainly not going to cut it, ever. It will only leave both parties very frustrated and very discouraged. So my encouragement for you today is to study your spouse. Come on, it's not that hard. You know your spouse well, take it deeper. Study your spouse. If you want to continue on this journey of oneness, it will require a desire to continually learn about the one that you have committed to. Things do change over the years. We know that. We grow over the years. So if you want to keep knowing your spouse deeply, you got to keep asking those questions. So study your spouse. Pay attention to the things that they love, the things that bother them. Pay attention to the anxieties that they voice and the gifts that they even have, what they bring to your marriage, what they bring to your family, what they bring to this world. And like any good student, once you have gathered all that information, apply it. Don't just keep it right here and know it, apply it. Apply it. Use this information that you've gathered to treat them, to protect them, to support them, to love them and serve them. Asking good questions and committing to study will allow you to further understand one another, the one that you have chosen to spend the rest of your life with. It's what makes the connections to the areas that you can complement and complete each other. God has designed you to be together. So study and learn and use those complements to serve each other and to love each other. Now, if you're married, I want to invite you to do something. And I know I'm asking a lot when I ask these kinds of things, especially if you have children, but I want to invite you to do this. So please really, truly take this and consider this. I want to invite you to plan an intentional getaway with your spouse. Doesn't matter how long that is, wherever you are right now, maybe you're really busy in your season of work or whatever it is. So if you can't take a couple of days, take a couple of hours. If you can take a couple of days, great. But plan an intentional getaway with your spouse. whether it's a couple hours or a couple days, just do it. Take a night out for dinner or go take a hike together. If you can't get away, just sit down in your own house and play a board game after the kids go to bed. But spend some intentional time together, getting to know the other person, getting to know again the person you married. And if you're not currently married, I still have a job for you. I ask you to please pray and think about a couple that you know needs that intentional time. And if they have kids, babysit their kids for them. If it's just to go out to dinner and you feel it laid on your heart, get them a gift card to a place where they can go out to dinner and spend time together. And be praying, most importantly, be praying for their marriage. You know, a marriage in God's eyes is made up of one man and one woman who have committed their entire lives to serve each other well. Marriage is an institution that God made up. All right, this is not a human thing. This is something God made. He has designed male and female to complement each other. Marriage is a lot more, the video said this, that it's a lot more than just a few rings. It's about a lot more than just some cake and even the Cupid Shuffle. Anybody know the Cupid Shuffle? Yeah, it's about a whole lot more than all of that. A marriage is about the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God. If our marriage, as Paul said, is to be how Christ loves the church and how the church loves Christ, then there's our model, and we should be aiming for that. Marriage matters. It matters because it's a picture of Jesus' love to the world, and therefore you have a responsibility. You have a responsibility to love your spouse with the love of Jesus Christ. So make intentional decisions, intentional actions to sacrifice or to sacrificially love your spouse. I think one of the best ways that we can emphasize this relationship that married couples have and be remembering what that really means in the eyes of God is to be remembering the relationship that we have with Christ, especially through Holy Communion.